support unpaid carers.
We now come to the statements, in which I will call the Home Secretary. Home Secretary Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement on the United Kingdom's approach to the global migration challenge. The United Kingdom has a long and proud history of offering sanctuary to refugees. In recent years alone, we have welcomed more than 185,000 people through safe and legal routes, including from Syria, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and more recently, Ukraine. In addition, we have welcomed more than 40,000 people in recent years through our refugee family reunion routes. This government has done more than any other in recent history to support those fleeing persecution, conflict or instability. But we cannot focus our support on those who need it most or effectively control our borders without tackling illegal migration, which, Mr. Speaker, is facilitated by people smugglers, serious organised criminals that profit from human misery, who do not care about people drowning in the Channel or suffocating in the back of containers. We must break their lethal and evil business model by removing the demand for their repugnant activities. This type of illegal migration puts unsustainable pressures on our public services and local communities. Every day, the broken asylum system costs the taxpayer almost £5 million in hotel accommodation alone. The cost of the asylum system is the highest in over 2 decades at over £1.5 billion. And as the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, said last week, we cannot sustain a parallel illegal system. Our compassion may be infinite, but our capacity to help people is not. But this is why the new plan for immigration and its legislative vehicle, the National Anti-Borders Bill, are so vital. And once again, I urge honourable members, but also members in the other place, to follow this elected House in backing the bill. At the heart of this government's approach is a simple principle, Mr. Speaker: fairness. Access to the UK's asylum system should be based on need, not on the ability to pay people smugglers. Mr. Speaker, more than 80 million people around the world are displaced. Others are on the move because they want a better life. There is a global migration crisis that demands innovative and international solutions, and this government is taking firm action. When I published the new plan for immigration back in March last year, we set out 3 very clear objectives: to increase the fairness and efficacy of our system so that we can better protect and support those in genuine need of asylum; to deter illegal and dangerous routes of entry to the UK, thereby breaking the business model of criminal smuggling networks and protecting the lives of those they endanger; and, Mr. Speaker, to remove more easily from the UK those with no right to be here. The Ministry of Defence has taken command of small boat operations in the Channel. Every small boat incident will be investigated to determine who piloted the boat and could therefore be liable for prosecution. These reforms are a truly cross-government effort, including the Home Office, the MOD, the Crown Prosecution Service, Border Force and the Ministry of Justice. A nationwide dispersal system will be introduced so that asylum pressures are more equally spread across local authorities. Currently, 53% of local authorities in England, Scotland and Wales do not accommodate asylum seekers under the dispersal system. It is simply unfair that a national burden should be felt disproportionately by certain areas of the country. For the first time, Mr. Speaker, the government is building asylum reception centres to end the practice of housing asylum seekers in expensive hotels. A new reception centre in Linton upon Ouse in North Yorkshire will open shortly. Far from being outlandish, as some of the opposition have commented, asylum reception centres are already operational in safe EU countries such as Greece, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, they are funded by the EU. And just last week, I signed a new world-leading migration and economic development partnership with Rwanda. Under this partnership, Those who travel to the UK by illegal and dangerous routes, including by small boats across the Channel, may be relocated to Rwanda, where they will have their asylum claims considered. Those in need of protection will be given up to 5 years of support, including education and employment training, help with integration, accommodation, healthcare, so that they can thrive there, Mr. Speaker. The UK is supporting this investment in Rwanda over 5 years, boosting the Rwandan economy and increasing the opportunities of people living there, further cementing the trading and diplomatic relationship between our countries. Mr. Speaker, this is a bespoke international agreement reached last week with Rwanda. I came to Parliament as soon as was reasonably practical following the conclusion of that agreement. This agreement is comparable with all our domestic and international legal obligations. Rwanda is a state party to the 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention and the 7 core United Nations Human Rights Convention, and has a strong system for refugee resettlement. The United Nations has used Rwanda for several years to relocate refugees, Mr. Speaker. And, of course, Mr. Speaker, it was the European Union who first funded this. This agreement deals a major blow to the people smugglers and their evil trade in human cargo. Everyone who is considered for relocation will be screened and interviewed, including an age assessment, and have access to legal services. Mr. Speaker, in relation to accounting officer advice, contrary to reports in the newspapers, the Permanent Secretary did not oppose this agreement nor assert that it is poor value for money. Rather, he stated in his role as accounting officer that the policy is regular, proper and feasible, but there is not currently sufficient evidence to demonstrate value for money. It is the job of ministers to take decisions, Mr. Speaker, and it is the job of ministers, Mr. Speaker, more often than not, to take tough decisions in the interest of our country. Existing approaches, Mr. Speaker, have failed, and there is no one single solution to tackle these problems, something that I think the benches opposite may have encountered in the past as well. Change is needed because people are dying attempting to come to the UK on illegal and dangerous routes. This partnership is a type of international cooperation needed to make the global immigration system fairer, keep people safe and give them opportunities to flourish. This will help break the people smugglers' business model and prevent the loss of life while ensuring protection for those who are genuinely vulnerable. This government is delivering the first comprehensive overhaul of the asylum system and this type of illegal migration in decades. At the heart of this approach, Mr. Speaker, is fairness. Access to the UK's asylum system must be based on need, not the ability to pay people smugglers. And the demands on the current system, the cost of British taxpayers and the scandalous abuses are increasing. The British public have rightly had enough. Our new plan for immigration will improve and support those directly fleeing oppression, persecution and tyranny through safe and legal routes. It will deter illegal and dangerous routes of entry to the UK, make it easier to remove those with no right to be in the UK, and, Mr. Speaker, provide a common-sense approach to controlling immigration, both legal and illegal. I commend the statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen over the last week, Mr. Speaker, this unworkable, shameful and desperate attempt to distract from the Prime Minister's law-breaking that the Home Secretary should not go along with because she is undermining not just respect for the rule of law, but also her office by providing cover for him. The policies that she has announced today are unworkable, unethical and extortionate in the cost for the British taxpayer. There's no information from the Home Secretary about the costs today. Will she admit the 120 million she's announced doesn't pay for a single person to be transferred? She hasn't actually got an agreement on the price for each person. In fact, the £120 million is the eye-watering price the Home Office is paying just for a press release. So what's the rest of the cost? What is this year's budget? How many people will it cover? The Home Office has briefed it might be £30,000 per person to cover up to 3 months accommodation, but that is already 3 times more than the ordinary cost of dealing with an asylum case in the UK. And her statement says she's going to provide 5 years of cost. Well, in Australia, offshoring costs £1.7 million per person. That is over 100 times more than the ordinary asylum cost from here. So where is all the money going to come from in order to fund this plan? She says she's going to save money on hotels, but the only reason we're paying a fortune in hotel costs is because the Home Office decision-making has totally collapsed. On her watch, Home Office are only taking 14,000 initial asylum decisions a year. That is half what they were doing 5 years ago, half. Taking fewer decisions than Belgium, Netherlands, Austria, never mind France and Germany. So the costs to the UK taxpayer have soared by hundreds of millions of pounds because she isn't capable of taking the basic asylum decisions. And because she's not capable of taking those decisions, she is trying to pay Rwanda to take those decisions instead. Whether people are refugees or not, whether they are victims of modern slavery or not, whether they have family in the UK, whether they've come from Afghanistan, Syria or even Ukraine. She is asking them to do the job that she is not capable of. She says it will deter boats and traffickers, but the Permanent Secretary says otherwise. He says there's no evidence of a deterrent effect, and there has been a total failure to crack down on criminal gangs that are at the heart of this problem. The prosecutions for human trafficking, for non-sexual exploitation, are down from 59 in 2015 to just 2 in 2020. Just 2. Well, the criminals won't be deterred because someone they exploited was sent to Rwanda. They don't give money-back guarantees, which means they lose money if their victims end up somewhere else instead. They will just spin more lies, and she is totally failing to crack down on those criminal gangs. So why not get on with her basic job instead? Properly crack down on human traffickers. Do the serious work with France and Belgium to prevent the boats setting off instead. She didn't even mention in this statement, and make decisions fast. The Home Secretary is just using this policy to distract from years of failure. She promised 3 years ago to halve the number of crossings, and instead they have increased tenfold. And this will make it worse for trafficking. The top police chief and modern slavery commissioner has said her legislation will make it harder to prosecute traffickers. When Israel tried paying Rwanda to take refugees and asylum seekers a few years ago, independent reports showed it increased people smuggling and increased the action of the criminal gangs. And that is the damage she is doing. She is making it easier for the criminal gangs and harder for those who need support. At a time when people across our country have come forward to help those who are fleeing Ukraine, to help desperate refugees, instead of working properly with other countries, the Home Secretary is doing the opposite. All she is doing is making it easier for the criminal gangs. So will she tell us the facts, the real costs of this policy, the real damage it's going to do to human trafficking and people smugglers, and come clean with the public and come clean with the House?
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I should just say that response was just somewhat wholly predictable, if I may say so. And I think it's important just to say to everyone in the House right now, you cannot put a price on saving human lives. And I think everyone will respect that completely. And, Mr. Speaker, if I may, the Honourable Lady was a minister in the Blair government when the powers that have given this government to undertake the legal basis of this policy were introduced back then. And I don't remember the current Home Secretary, Shadow Home Secretary, exploding in this synthetic rage when she occupied a seat in the Blair government, when all those policies were put in action. And those, Mr. Speaker, were acts passed in 1999, 2002, 2004 for partnerships in this similar way. By the way, the same partnerships and that were used to put in place the Dublin regulations to return inadmissible asylum seekers to EU member states. And of course, the Honourable Lady has gone on the record multiple times to attack the government for leaving those regulations, while at the same time calling for a replacement to be put in place. Now she's attacking the government for using the very powers that only a few weeks ago she was saying that we still could be using if we hadn't left the EU. I think, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, what we've seen today from the party opposite and from the Honourable Lady is, quite frankly, their absolute inability to understand this issue, this differentiation between legal migration and illegal migration. They should be honest about their policies. Their position is to stand for open borders and uncontrolled immigration. And, Mr. Speaker, if I may just go even further, I mean, she speaks about the policy being unworkable and then extortionate. Well, if the policy is unworkable, it can't then be extortionate, because we'll be making payments based on delivery. And this is the point about our scheme, that there is nothing that she has said today that actually puts an alternative forward, that actually seeks to deal with the issue of people trafficking, deaths in the Channel, and importantly, I think the Labour Party being exposed today for having no policy, no idea as to stop people smuggling.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say, with respect to my right honourable friend, that from what I have heard and seen so far of this policy, I do not support the removal to Rwanda policy on the grounds of legality, practicality and efficacy. But I want to ask her about one very specific issue. I understand that those who will be removed will only be young men, that families will not be... well, the Home Secretary is shaking her head, so I've obviously misunderstood the policy in that sense. But if it is the case that families will not be broken up, and the Home Secretary is nodding, does she not believe, and where is her evidence, that this will not simply lead to an increase in the trafficking of women and children?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to meet with the Right Honourable Lady to discuss this further and actually give her further information on this. No, actually calm down and listen. I think first and foremost, just on the policy is legal, and there's been a published MOU that speaks very, very clearly, well, you're not even listening, so there's no point to it. That spells out the MOU very clearly in terms of the legal. If you're interested in listening to responses, then please do. That there is an MOU that has been published which spells out in full detail the legalities, but also the nature of the agreement. Now, I think the Right Honourable Lady would respect the fact that I'm not going to come to the floor of the House and speak about the eligibility criteria, because she will know. Because actually, if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady will know very, very well that actually it's that type of criteria that is used by the smuggling gangs to then effectively exploit various loopholes in our existing laws when it comes to various issues such as legal action that is undertaken to prevent removals, some of which, if I may, Mr. Speaker, just add, there are many members opposite that write letters to me frequently to say, please don't remove some of the failed asylum seekers, but also foreign national offenders, people that have actually got no legal basis to remain in our country. But I'd be happy to meet with the Right Honourable Lady on
Spokesperson Stuart C. MacDonald.
Here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a cruel and a catastrophic policy. It will not hurt smugglers, but will further seriously harm people who have fled persecution. It will do untold damage to the international system of refugee protection and to what little remains of the UK's reputation for upholding international law. Mr. Speaker, this is worse than temporary offshoring. It is offloading of responsibility altogether. As the UNHCR has said, people fleeing persecution should not be treated like commodities. And in the words of the Refugee Council, this is nothing short of cash for deportations. 85% of refugees are in developing or the least developed countries already. Here is a wealthy UK offering cash to take some more. So much for global Britain. Mr. Speaker, the only thing that's transparent about this policy is its dodgy timing and grubby political motivation. So, in the interests of proper transparency, will she finally publish a detailed estimate of how many billions this policy will cost? She was chuntering that she had the deal all sorted out. She can now announce it to members of this House. And for what are we paying this money? Can she say what percentage of asylum seekers coming to the UK will be subjected to this abysmal treatment? Reports from Rwanda suggest capacity probably around 1%, but certainly less than 5%. Is that correct? We are told that people will be screened before transfer, but how can a pathetic screening interview possibly pick out trafficking survivors or torture victims or LGBT people? Quite simply, it can't. So is she happy to see these people subjected to this treatment? And why are women and children within the scope of this policy? And will people going through that screening process be able to access legal advice?
Oh, yeah, I doubt it.
Mr Speaker, why aren't we allowed to see the criteria for deciding who will be sent? Where is the transparency in that? And how will she monitor their treatment? Her government has completely failed to stop abuses in UK detention centres, never mind centres that are 5,000 miles away. So, Mr Speaker, in short, this disastrous policy has nothing to do with the global migration crisis. It has everything to do with it distracting from the PM's political crises, and it is absolutely sickening for all of that.
Well, Mr Speaker, if I may, just for the record, I actually think the Honourable Gentleman's latter comment was absolutely unacceptable. And actually, if I may, it does a great disservice, not just to members, not just to this government and officials that have worked for over 9 months on this partnership, but also to our counterparts in the world in Rwanda that have been working with us, and many of my own international counterparts as well, that are working collectively together to tackle issues of illegal migration, and if I may say so, some counterparts in the EU as well. And if I may, just to answer some very, very specific points, I think it is shameful that he is playing party political games on that point, just like the party opposite as well. No, absolutely not. If you want to let me answer the question and finish, I will. I think the other point to make, Mr Speaker, is that Rwanda actually is home to resettling over 130,000 refugees, and they have done that successfully. And if I may, I think your comments are a slur to the successful efforts of our partners in Rwanda. Rwanda is a safe and secure country with the respect for the rule of law. And no, absolutely not. I actually think members should just listen to the undercurrent of their tone towards the country of Rwanda, which has done a great deal to provide safety and refuge and security and a new life to many, many refugees around the world. He asked about the approach that would be taken. Everyone considered for relocation will be screened, interviewed and have access to legal advice. Decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, and nobody will be removed if it's unsafe or inappropriate for them at all. Now, I also, if I may, Mr Speaker, I'd just like to conclude by making another point as well, because he is not the first honourable member to mention legal obligations and the legalities of this. Rwanda, like us, is beholden to the same legal obligations as the United Kingdom on human rights. And if I may, I just want to make the point again. I think there is something really, really quite unpleasant about the undercurrent of the tone that is taken to Rwanda from policy.
Gary Sambrook.
Sorry, Mr Speaker, I didn't hear. In latest figures suggested, Mr Speaker, in Birmingham, over 7,000 people in December were claiming asylum support, amounting to tens of millions of pounds. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this plan and partnership with Rwanda will reduce the reliance on hotels and bring down small boat crossings?
Oh, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I think actually there are a number of things. If the honourable lady wants to be less hysterical and actually listen, she might actually learn something about the new plan for immigration. I think it is important to reflect, Mr Speaker, on a number of points. The answer to my honourable friend is absolutely yes, because we do not want people in hotel accommodation. And of course it's a cheap point for the opposition benches to make, but with the pandemic we absolutely had to use hotel accommodation as part of dispersal to actually keep people protected during the pandemic. That was a fact, and Public Health England guidance spoke to that. And of course on decision making, yes of course, and on decision making, if you choose to listen, that's exactly what the new plan for immigration is about, in terms of speeding up asylum decision making and processing with this legislation and digitalisation of the system. And I have to add, Mr Speaker, of course, every single member on the opposite benches have voted against this policy. They clearly want open borders, they just want to have uncontrolled migration, and they've done nothing themselves to come up with an alternative plan on this issue.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The announcement made last week when Parliament wasn't sitting has caused a great deal of confusion around what this policy actually entails. Unfortunately, the Home Secretary turned her head away from the microphone when she was responding to the Right Honourable Lady for Maidenhead. So I wonder if the Home Secretary could answer the question about who would actually be eligible to be sent to Rwanda. Is it going to be single young men? Is it going to be women and children? And what percentage of asylum seekers does the Home Secretary think will be sent to Rwanda?
Mr. Speaker, just on the on eligibility, as I have already said, everyone considered for relocation will be screened, interviewed, have the right access to legal advice and services, and decisions will be made on a case-by-case basis. That is absolutely right and proper. But there is also the fundamental principle right now in relation to this policy and the new plan for immigration, which I'm sure she is well versed in, is that this will apply to people that are inadmissible to our asylum system and people that have come to our country illegally through illegal and dangerous routes.
Kevin Hollingray.
Mr. Speaker, the asylum reception centre my right one friend refers to is situated in my constituency of Linton and Ouse. Not a NIMBY in any shape or form, but nevertheless this is a small rural village. It is the RAF base it's going to be situated on is right in the centre of that village. There are understandable concerns from local people that this is not the appropriate place to put such a reception centre. Would my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss the decision and see what can be done?
Absolutely, and if I may, Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank my honourable friend as well, because he has been in dialogue with ministers on this issue. I'd be very, very happy to meet with him, and of course he does understand the principle behind all of this, so I'm very happy to discuss this with him further.
Dan Abbott.
The Home Secretary asserts that Labour members do not understand the issue, but she will be aware that a former permanent secretary at the Home Office, Sir David Normington, said last week about her Rwanda policy that it's inhumane, it's morally reprehensible, it's probably unlawful, and it may well be unworkable. How does she come to know better than a former Home Office Permanent Secretary?
Mr. Speaker, if I may tell the Right Honourable Lady, I'm surprised the Right Honourable Lady is using Sir David's name in vain, given it was also a former Labour Home Secretary who infamously and discourteously described the Home Office leadership and management at the time as not fit for purpose during Sir David's tenure. If I may, things have moved on in terms of the asylum in terms of the asylum system right now, which is why the new plan for immigration, which her party and members on the opposite benches continuously vote against, have no plan to deal with these important and difficult issues, and at the same time will bring in the reform that our country needs, while making sure that we preserve the efficacy of safe and legal routes for people that are fleeing persecution to come to our country and get the support that they need.
Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend deserves great personal credit for seeking to tackle this dreadful crisis which exists in the Channel. But will she accept that many of us have grave concerns that the policy she has announced simply will not work? On the subject of cost, can she confirm that she will not be using expensive military aircraft to make this 9,000-mile round trip? And on the subject of cost also, will she ensure before the House of Commons votes on this matter tomorrow that we know the cost per asylum seeker of those she is sending to Rwanda?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, right honourable friend, who knows Rwanda as a country incredibly well, if I may say so, and we've had many discussions in the past about Rwanda. I'm very happy to meet with him and have further discussions with him as well. We will not be using military planes for any removals, but he will also, and actually many members of this House will be pretty familiar with the approach that we do take to removing failed asylum seekers and foreign national offenders, to either returning them to their country of origin or to third countries. There is a whole process around this, which is a lot of operational work and details that take place. So I'm happy to talk to him privately about that, because these are complicated ways in which we can do this. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman makes further points that I'm very happy to discuss with him as well.
Live effort.
Mr. Speaker, can the Home Secretary say whether she's negotiated a cap on the cost of this arrangement with Rwanda? What will be the cost per person sent, and whether there's a limit on that cost? If so, what is it?
Mr. Speaker, in terms of costs, as I've already published and said, there is an upfront £120 million development cost. And with that, of course, when we remove people, payments will be made accordingly, only once we've removed people to Rwanda.
Dame Andrew Lent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm incredibly proud of this country and this government's track record in providing safe welcome to over 185,000 asylum seekers and refugees since 2015. And I do hope my right honourable friend will be ramping up the welcome for Ukrainian refugees. I know she'll be working flat out at it. But what I do find absolutely abhorrent and inexplicable is the way that many on the opposition benches, and in fact even in the top echelons of the Church of England and in other faiths, who have completely forgotten the images of children lying drowned on our beaches. How can they not seek to try and remedy that appalling situation? These are not refugees and asylum seekers. They are coming from France.
I thank my right honourable friend for her comments and observations. And first of all, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend will be very, very well aware of the work that our noble friend Lord Harrington is doing in the other place on the Ukrainian scheme right now, in terms of resettling and bringing people over for the Homes to Ukraine scheme. If I may, Mr. Speaker, the left in particular, they like to preach compassion, but there is little compassion when they do not have the backbone to actually make difficult decisions when it comes to the protection of human life. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, for months and months and months, they talk about saving lives and lost lives. And now that there is the prospect for action to save lives and to go after the evil people smugglers, they wring their hands and they choose to play party political games.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members across this House are desperately concerned about the children who are often on these boats. So can we have a straight answer from the Home Secretary? Does she intend for one of the criteria to be that prevents somebody being sent to Rwanda to be being under 18? And crucially, where will the processing and the decision-making as to whether or not somebody is under 18 take place? Please, Home Secretary, be straight and honest with us what you intend to do with these children. We all deserve better.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, if I may, I've already spoken about the processing and the eligibility. Yes, I have. I absolutely have. And operational decisions are for the officials and the practitioners on the ground that undertake them. And that is part of our process that she should respect.
Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Shadow Home Secretary was slightly wrong when she talked about human trafficking. This isn't human trafficking, this is people smuggling. This is where evil gangs are paid money to take people across the channel. They don't care about the lives of these individuals. And the only way you're going to stop the people smuggling is if you reduce the demand for it. And the Home Secretary's Rwanda policy is absolutely right. Would you agree with me that her policy is morally the right thing to do?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. There is a distinction and a significant difference between people trafficking and smuggling. It is the smuggling gangs, the people smuggling gangs that we are trying to stop. We are trying to break up their business model and end their evil trade, and it's absolutely right that we do so. And when it comes to cases of human trafficking, it is a well-known fact, and in fact it is down to the work of my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, and the work with the Modern Day Slavery Act, and the work of this government that actually has stood up the legalities and the proper processes to give those people that have been trafficked the legal protection and the safety and security that they need in our country.
Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Home Secretary tell the House how many people does she expect to send to Rwanda in the first 12 months of this scheme? She will be aware that Rwandan government ministers are on the record as saying that they expect their capacity to be in hundreds with a few thousand over the 5-year period. Given that 28,000 people crossed the Channel last year, does she really think that this scheme is going to have the deterrent effect she claims for it?
So his question is yes, and the scheme is uncapped, and that is exactly what we've negotiated with the Rwandan government.
David Davis.
The Home Secretary is quite properly